A good afternoon to everyone in Taiwan and good morning to people in Europe, including Clover. It's actually a national holiday today. It's the National Day of Taiwan today, and it's nice to still have so many people here. And because it's a holiday, I think it's a good thing in the sense that we probably feel more relaxed, and I want this conversation to be more engaged and more opened so that more people can really get in touch with your feelings about climate and the environment, the entire ecosystem, the earth, and get in touch with your feelings. And then you must have questions, I'm sure, and then you can ask Clover your questions. I'll first very briefly introduce my institution and our program, and very, very briefly about Clover, because I want people to hear Clover herself talking about her journey. I was just listening again to the podcast that led me to you, Clover. The Way Out is In. I don't know if you know that episode is really tear-jerking. And okay, but my name is Qianyi Liu. I'm a research fellow here at the Institute of European and American Studies, Academia Sinica in Taipei, Taiwan. I'm also a member of a idea lab here at the Institute. It's called Farm for Change. We have an actual organic farm at our rooftop, but we also want to plant seeds of ideas to inspire people to act. And previously, we have invited people like Timothée Barik and James Boyce. Timothée Barik talked about degrowth. James Boyce talked about carbon dividend. And we had Simon Council talking about the hypocrisy of nature-based solutions. We also had Juliet Shore talking about 4-day working weeks. And all those talks, we put up Chinese subtitles. And you can find those wonderful talks in our Farm for Change website. And today, likewise, we are going to record, and I will put up Chinese subtitles. I think this will benefit many, many people. And so very briefly introducing Clover. Clover is the founder of an organization called the Force of Nature. And this organization, what they do is they channel people's anxiety or adjust their mindsets so that they can, if they have anxiety about the climate or fear or anger or despair, they just help to channel these energy into agency or action. And they work with young people, including students. And I don't know how young the students are. Maybe you can talk about that later. And they also work with business people, including CEOs and policymakers. So this organization is quite young, I think 5-year-old Force of Nature. And so they also help to develop the skills to help people make a difference. So I'll make my introduction very short because I think people want to hear from you. Clover, can you tell us about your journey, how you became an activist, why you founded Force of Nature, and including the sad story that you told in the podcast about COP26? Just can you begin there?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for joining today. And I'm sorry to have kept you waiting as well. I'm not sure why I'm having so many tech issues this morning in a new country in Estonia today. So that might be it. But very excited to be joining you all. By way of, introduction. So I first started out as a climate activist at the age of 11. I was really in response to watching documentaries, kind of I felt very sheltered from a lot of the world's issues as a young person. And yet when I discovered documentaries like An Inconvenient Truth and The Cove and Food Inc., it was really like having that reality bubble kind of burst. And I remember at that time feeling a lot of confusion. I couldn't really understand why I hadn't learned about the climate crisis at school, why we hadn't talked about it at the dinner table, why I didn't see it on TV when my parents watched the news. And I also remember feeling an emotion that I think is shared by a lot of young people when they first learn about the climate and ecological crisis, which is one of betrayal. It was very much this feeling that I'd kind of been lied to by the adults in my life, and a real questioning of all the kind of stories that I had grown up with and that I held to be true. So when I was 11, I decided that I wanted to become an activist. I didn't entirely know what that meant or what that looked like, but I told my parents that's how I wanted to spend the rest of my life. And that was really the catalyst that put me on the path that I'm on today. So in terms of the kind of origin of Force of Nature, when I was 19, I was working as a sustainability consultant in London. I was going into the boardrooms of major corporations and seeing a very prevalent level of denial, all manifestations of denial. And in my spare time, I was going into classrooms and I was talking to young people. And the first time I went into a classroom to volunteer and run a workshop, I kind of went in prepared to teach these young people as young as 11 and 12 years old about climate change, right? What is it? How is it impacting our lives? But I quickly learned that they didn't need a lesson or education in climate change. Instead, what I was met with, what I heard from them, was a very deep feeling of despair, very deep feeling of anxiety about this crisis. I met with young people who told me about these apocalyptic dreams that they were having. This was during the wildfires back in my home country of Australia. So there were very apocalyptic kind of images in the news and in the headlines. I met 12 and 13-year-old girls who told me they'd already decided they didn't want to have children because they didn't want to bring them into a world defined by climate collapse. So there was a real heaviness there that I wasn't really expecting. And I think hearing the honesty and openness of those young people, it did two things. For one, it kind of forced me to acknowledge my own feelings. At that point, 8 years into my career, as an activist working on sustainability, I think I'd really learned to kind of compartmentalize a lot of my feelings about the climate crisis and sort of like hide behind this veneer of like optimism or charade of optimism. And I think that was kind of the expectation placed on me as well as a young activist. When I would go into boardrooms or when I'd speak at events, people would say, we want you to inspire us, right? We want you to help people feel optimistic, in a world that feels increasingly terrifying. And for a long time, and I didn't realize this, but talking to these young people helped me realize this, I had kind of been evading those feelings, running away from them. And so I think talking to those young people forced me to recognize the kind of heaviness that I was carrying, which is shared by so many in my generation. But it also showed me the critical importance of these feelings, right? I think most of us are kind of sleepwalking when it comes to the climate crisis, and whatever you want to call it, eco-anxiety, climate anxiety is a very healthy psychological response. And we need to understand how to really translate those feelings into action, right? Because if we just sit in those feelings of fear and despair and disillusionment, they can very quickly kind of ferment into a sort of like powerlessness and paralysis in response to climate change. So I was very interested in how do we help young people like myself and really the generation who are inheriting the worst impacts of the climate crisis to translate those feelings into meaningful action. So that instead of feeling shut down by them, they can recognize that those feelings are kind of the superpower that like fuels and motivates this work. So that was really the inspiration behind Force of Nature. And since then, as you alluded to, we've gone on to engage tens of thousands of young people around the world, running programs. Our flagship program is the Anxiety to Agency program, which helps young people come into conversation with those climate emotions. And we also launched a series of trainings for young people on everything from engaging with decision makers in business through to public speaking, through to facilitating workshops, because we recognize it's not just enough to help young people get clear on where they want to create change in the world. It's really critically important that we help young people develop the skills and experience they need to translate that knowledge into action long term and really find careers for themselves, right? And we're at an interesting, I think, inflection point for this kind of youth activist movement. Many of us, as activists, we don't get paid for our work very often. And that's kind of a beautiful thing on the one hand, because we're in this because we care, right? We have no ulterior motive for doing this work. But it does two things. I mean, one, it means that the work is very difficult to sustain, right? It also means that it gears toward a very privileged subset of young people who have the time and resource to be able to essentially do activism in their spare time. And, if we want to create a movement that is representative of all of the diversity of young people that make up Gen Z, Gen Alpha who are coming through, we need to really identify what those barriers to access are. And so often we hear that it is kind of unpaid labor. So again, a lot of our focus at Force of Nature really evolved to encapsulate that, to find financial opportunities for young people to be able to do this work long term.
I have I have many questions, but I want to first ask the flip side of what the kind of young people that you have engaged with. Obviously, they care very much and they want to do as much as they can. But if many young people also care as much as they do, the movement would have been much easier. So that, which means a lot of young people still don't seem to care. That's sometimes I have this feeling that people are numb, and that could be defense mechanism, because it's just not something that's joyful. That's not something people want to really face. So even among young people, sometimes, at least here in Taiwan, there are young people who care, but in general, I think both the media, the corporation, the politicians, they do a great job conveying the feeling that everything is under control. So young people, they are still very much just do their own thing. They're studying, their video games, I don't know. So do you also work on how to wake up people who don't seem to have that kind of anxiety, who don't seem to be panicking, or not the type of young climate youth, the opposite, the other kind? Do you also have tips of how to wake them up, or to let more people become more like the climate youth?
Yeah, it's such a good observation. And there's a lot that I want to say on this. I think, for one, it's really important to recognize, like, what are the influences that are kind of colonizing young people's minds, right? And there are very deep vested interests in switching us off, on numbing us, right? And that is no accident, right? Whether you look at the advertising industry, which spends billions of dollars every year convincing young people, particularly young women, that they're, not skinny enough, they're not pretty enough, they'll only be good enough if they buy these products, if they wear these makeup brands. Like, there's a very focused effort on convincing us we're not enough, right? Because that is ultimately what fuels kind of consumerism. So there's a lot influencing my generation in terms of what will make you feel enough, and by extension, what is good, what is aspirational, right? You see these kind of like massive fashion hauls of like fast fashion, influencer culture. It's kind of really just run away from us. And so there's that aspect. I think there's also the fact that, you know, for decades, scientists have been trying to ring the alarm and just becoming really exasperated, and many of them who I know, you know, really depressed that policymakers, leaders are not acting with the science in mind. There's a very powerful video that I shared yesterday on my social media of this meteorologist reporting on Hurricane Milton, which has come off the heels of Hurricane Helene, and just kind of breaking down, you know, and getting very choked up and emotional as he relays what's happening, because it's terrifying, right? And, you know, he's been doing this work for years, and we're kind of seeing now many of the huge disasters that scientists have been warning us about. And it's really hard to hold that grief and that knowledge of, you know, the climate breakdown that is already kind of locked in. And in response to that, we're not seeing, you know, inspirational leadership. We're seeing people in positions of power kind of hurling blame at one another. Another influence is, you know, the rise of kind of sustainable consumerism and this narrative which has been created by big corporations like BP, who created the carbon footprint calculator in the mid-2000s, which redirects attention away from themselves and onto everyday individuals, and places responsibility and blame with the everyday citizen. And so all of this to say, each of these influences, whether it's the drive of consumer culture, whether it's a failure of leadership, whether it's corporations shining attention on everyday people, I think has created a public that feels deeply disillusioned and doesn't really know how to even look in the face of what's happening and do something about it. And I think from the conversations I've had with young people, when they're initially dismissive of, you know, climate change, and I ask, you know, some, you know, more pressing kind of probing questions, what always comes to light is, oh, well, you know, we're doomed, right? Or, you know, it's too late, the system's too broken, you know, I'm just one person, what am I really supposed to do about this? You know, and there's a lot of that rhetoric even within the scientific community of like, you know, we've missed the 1.5 degree threshold, like kind of let's just throw our hats in. And so I think that numbness or that apathy is often, in fact, an expression of this deep feeling of powerlessness. And I see that obviously in a lot of young people who would appear to be switched off from these crises. I also see it in business leaders. I see it in policymakers. Like I've been in the boardrooms of, you know, major corporations, CEOs who govern tens of thousands of employees, billions of dollars in budget, and they themselves say, but I'm just one person. Like, what do you expect me to do about it? What about our competitor? Or often in the UK, pointing the finger, what about China? What about India? It's like this constant merry-go-round of kind of blaming someone else and disavowing that personal responsibility. I think also with young people today, they feel disillusioned because, you know, we want to see immediate impacts, right? Like we want to see the effects of our activism. And a lot of young people, you know, will take to the streets. We've seen this with the protests in response to the genocide in Palestine, now in Lebanon as well. You know, millions of people have participated in protests. Millions of people have taken to the streets. And we've seen barely a budge in terms of the UK and the US supplying arms to Israel. And so I think a lot of young people say, well, even when I do, you know, post on social media and show up in the streets and use my voice, do all of these things, what does it really amount to? And that's why, in response to all of those feelings, and in terms of, I think, how to help wake up young people who might feel numbed, it's really important to contextualize this moment in the span of history. You know, I meet a lot of young people who participate in, you know, wanting to create a certain policy change or wanting, you know, to lead a campaign with a certain outcome. And when that doesn't happen, I think it's easy to internalize this feeling of like, I'm not good enough, nothing I do matters. But if we look to history, we see just how many people it took and just how much time it took to create the kind of changes in our society that we take for granted today. But I draw so much inspiration from people-powered movements. Like, if you look at the suffragist movement in the UK, for example, this was a movement that culminated in the Equal Franchise Act in 1928. So less than 100 years ago in the UK, were all women finally allowed to vote. That was a struggle spanning almost 3/4 of a century, right? So the first suffragists organized in the 1860s. They slowly built a foundation of a movement. It wasn't then until the suffragettes came along decades later who participated in direct action. So it was the suffragettes who were, going on hunger strike, defacing buildings, destroying art and cultural monuments. They were very, kind of what were considered radical protesters. And then years again of women working during the war, showing their kind of role, not just in polite society, but their role in the economy, to finally get to this point where first white, middle-class, wealthy women were permitted the vote, and then all women across society were permitted the vote. I find that slice of history very inspiring. I think, one, to recognize the forces that these women were up against. Emmeline Pankhurst, who was a very prominent suffragette in the UK, during her life, it wasn't just that women were not able to vote, but in the UK, most forms of rape were legal, right? Marsha P. Johnson, a prominent queer activist during the Stonewall Uprising. For most of Marsha's life, it was illegal to be gay. It was illegal to be trans. Rosa Parks, right, who refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white man, within the civil rights movement, she was convicted, right? She was put in jail for that action. And so I think I draw so much inspiration from these activists, but I draw a lot of insight and wisdom, I think, from realizing just how long it took for change to happen. And so I think it's important to ground ourselves in that history, because we can look to the climate crisis, we can hold that urgency within ourselves and not let that go, right? It is immediate. We need transformative action. That can often feel impossible, but it is not going to happen overnight. It takes a long time, and it takes change happening from so many different places. Policymakers, judges throughout history, they're the ones who ratify change, right? They write it into law, they write it into legislation, but change was not instigated from them. It was instigated by people in the margins, people taking to the streets, predominantly young people who made up these protest movements. And so we can look to them to realize how change is going to happen, when it comes to solving the climate crisis as well.
Yeah, you're really inspiring. I think, yes, we can draw lessons from history, but at the same time, I also have the feeling that this time around it's different because there's like a very unforgiving deadline, and but it's also not a deadline. Even if we pass 1.5 or if we pass even 2, we still have to continue to struggle, because it's not like one day we all drop dead, because we have to continue to struggle, because people can, every effort that we make will make somebody suffer less, I think, because it's not one day the world stops. It's not like that. And I want to ask, you mentioned that for young people, it's usually the privileged few who can really work on activism, because people need to have to make a living, and people, because they have to make a living, they don't have the time. And that, I link that to what you just said about even CEOs. They feel like they are also kind of hijacked, or it's not their choice that they do what they do, because if he doesn't do it or she doesn't do it, somebody else in his or her position will do the same, and they still have to compete. And this is like young people, because of our system, the system kind of lock you in doing things that's harmful to the planet. And at the same time, because you have to make that money, because you have to make a living, young people feel like they have little alternatives. So I think my question is it from your talks in other places, I also sense that you seem to kind of hints that we are not so different from those CEOs or corporations or business people, because we are all victims of this system. And if that's the case, how can anybody do anything? Because the system is just like that. And the young people, they tune out because they have to find a job. They have to, and I also want to ask you about the career opportunities that you talk about. It's like a lot of young people I've observed, if they worry about climate change, and the most likely places they will likely end up with will be the sustainable consultant that you talked about. The most likely places they will end up being could be doing something like greenwashing for big businesses. I think there's a lot of this kind of green jobs, good green job opportunities, at least here in Taiwan. Here you can make a career out of, calculating how many emissions, carbon emissions this company or that company make. And it's really not serious climate action, but those jobs look so green, and so they are drawn there. But over time, some young people I meet, they also feel frustrated. So I think I have several questions there. I don't know if you can answer.
I'll throw some spaghetti on the wall and see what sticks. The first thing I would say is that it's incredibly important to have a kind of moral conviction, right? And I think this has long been a frustration of mine, going into climate conferences that are very kind of sanitized, that talk about climate change exclusively through the language of net zero or degrees of warming, and by extension propose solutions like carbon credits and carbon offsets. And it's all just very academic, but also kind of jargon filled and really divorced from people's everyday experiences. And I go to a lot of business sustainability conferences that attempt to make the business case for sustainability. And this was my frustration when I was working as a sustainability consultant, is that oftentimes the business case simply is not there, because the entire economic system that we have today is one, in countries like the UK and the US, of neoliberalism, right? It's the privatization of fundamental services. It's the commodification of nature. It's predicated on cheap labor, being able to exploit certain subsets of the population. We see all of that manifest in quote unquote sustainable solutions, like the rise of electric vehicles, which, don't get me wrong, are absolutely part of the green transition. However, I don't believe making sure everyone has access to an EV is inherently sustainable, because you look in the supply chains of these, cars and Teslas, and you have cobalt and lithium mining with huge human rights abuses in their supply chain. We've seen massive spikes in, child labor, exploitative labor conditions, so that we can fuel this green transition. And I just feel very frustrated by this rhetoric, because I don't believe we're going to get there by continuing this kind of charade of, let's focus on the solution that is sustainable and that is profitable, because oftentimes that case simply does not exist. And if it does, it exists because it is able to overlook a lot of injustice within the supply chain. And so for me, I'm much more interested in what is the moral case, right? And there's almost like an allergy to talking about ethics and morality, even within places like COP. It's almost seen as like a bit woo-woo and a bit fluffy. But the reality is, right, if we equate each fraction of a degree of warming, we're talking about hundreds of millions of lives, right? We're talking about the collapse of ecosystems. We're talking about the extinction of species. We're talking about the global north, in large part, essentially sacrificing communities in the global south, right? And so for me, that is fundamentally a question of our humanity. And that is what is being asked of us. Like, we're being asked to have moral courage in the face of a system that makes it fundamentally difficult, near impossible, to do the ethically right or responsible thing. So when I'm engaging with young people, when I'm engaging with business leaders, my argument is one that is rooted in that, in that ethical argument. And I think that is where eco-anxiety plays such an important part of this conversation. When I first started talking about my own eco-anxiety, I heard from thousands of young people around the world, but I also heard from a lot of people within, the media, like journalists, who were like, what's this latest phenomenon of the snowflake generation, right? Like, Gen Zers are just so sensitive about everything these days. Or I heard from people in climate who said it's defeatist to acknowledge your anxiety or your fear. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, this anxiety is such a psychologically healthy response. It's literally your body's internal alarm bell telling you, hey, something is really wrong, not only with this crisis that we're inheriting, but with the widespread inaction and kind of cultural gaslighting in response to it. So my work is about encouraging people to come into conversation with their emotions, to not judge those feelings, whether it is numbness or it's fear or grief or it's excitement at the opportunity. Like, there is no correct response to the climate crisis, but we need to give ourselves license to at least feel something, right? To not distract ourselves with scrolling, to not seek out things that are going to numb us. And to then create the space to say, okay, I as one person cannot solve all of the problems, but I as one person working in collective can have an impact on a problem that I'm really passionate about, right? We have this tendency to kind of like hero worship figures throughout history, right? The Martin Luther King or the Rosa Parks or the Marsha P. Johnson. These are the activists whose names we know, but they were the one drop in the bucket that tipped over the edge, right? They were the culmination or the single example of hundreds of thousands, millions of people choosing to participate. And the reality on climate is, as much as we see kind of denial in a lot of spaces, we read the, doomsday kind of headlines, there are so many people out there who are working on these problems, who are working on solutions. And I have to remind myself to go and seek out those people, because otherwise I can become very jaded and kind of cynical. But the reality is, you hear from a handful of climate activists. There are so many people out there who don't have platform, who don't have the privilege of a microphone, who don't have access to these spaces, who are just getting on and leading the solutions. And so rather than fixating our attention on, the people in power who are in denial, who are sticking their heads in the sand, some of them will have those moral awakenings. And I've seen it firsthand. I've gone into companies where, as a result of our team, talking to these leaders, multiple people have quit overnight and gone to join organizations, defected and said, I can no longer justify this. But I'm more interested in focusing on the people who are just out there, who are doing the work, right? And so I think it is a matter of kind of like ratios, right? Where we invest our time and energy. And I think sorry, this is a long answer, but the final thing I will say is that I think from a spiritual perspective, the only way to really be able to show up and do this work each day and sustain this work without like personally losing my mind, is to not focus on this unpredictable like outcome and future over which I as one person really have no control. I'm much more grounded in what is the morally right and responsible thing to do right now, right? And this kind of thought of, no matter what happens, I want to be able to get to the end of my life, hopefully happy and healthy, and look back on my life and know that I was someone who did something, right? I wasn't someone who sat in the margins. And I think when we look back on activists throughout history, it's easy to imagine and write ourselves into that history and to say, well, I would have been one of those 1300 suffragettes who went on hunger strike and went to prison, or I would have been one of those, allies marching in the street as part of the civil rights movement, or I would have been going, face to face with the police during the Stonewall riot. But we don't know that, right? And this moment is no different. Like, this moment demands such courage of each and every one of us. And we really need to be able to look ourselves in the eye and say, like, I was able to do something, right? And do something that, yes, was within my means, but do something that maybe even exceeded my expectations of what I thought I was capable of. So that is my invitation and call to action to people.
Great. Related to what you just said about spirituality, actually in our English title of this event, we put down mindfulness in action, in activism. I want to ask you, do you think at this point, when things are so grim, do you think without a spiritual grounding, do you think it is possible for either individual or a collective to move forward? That's the first part about spirituality. And you also mentioned not to focus on the doomsday predictions, but from scientific papers, especially the past few weeks, I've read a lot, and it really doesn't look very good. So I want to ask you, do you think it's necessary to, when you help, or when I try to help young people, would it be a good idea to also prepare ourselves as a collective for the collapse, or for there's a book by Jim Bendel, it's a Breaking Together. So some of my friends and myself were thinking about reading the book together. I've had the book for a while, but I kind of don't want to read it but it seems that we have come to a point. I don't know if we should prepare young people, we should prepare with them together, that we are facing collapse, and how we can face it more gracefully, in a way that's with more mutual aid, with less irrationality, with less barbarism, with less, I don't know, selfishness. So do you incorporate that aspect into your work with young people? And okay, so far these two, and I have more later. Sorry.
Well, such great questions. And yeah, I feel like I could speak for hours on each of them. Not necessarily eloquently, but they conjure a lot of thoughts and feelings. And I would also preempt what I'm about to say by saying that I don't think any of my beliefs or perspectives are necessarily static. Like, I think my response to this question today would probably be very different to my response tomorrow, and that is affected by being a fluid, transient being in a time that feels very kind of turbulent. And there are days where I feel much more hopeful, and there are days where I carry a lot more heaviness in my heart. The first thing I would say is that I think the approach of a lot of climate communicators has been, if we just relay the terrifying statistics, right? And if we tell people there's 10 years left to save the planet, now 5 years left, if we shock them with the headlines, if we talk about the planetary boundaries, like that will wake them up, right? That will jolt people into action. And that was kind of my belief when I started out as an activist. I had this sort of naivety. When I learned about climate change, I was like, well, I'm only learning about this for the first time. So if I can wake up enough people in my life, right, my friends, my family, my school, that's what we need to do, right? It's just, people just don't know. And there is a degree of truth to the fact that, we're competing with a very powerful lobby, the fossil fuel lobby, which has obfuscated the science and delayed action and confused people with misinformation. Like, that is all true. But I think as a community of climate communicators, we've also recognized that simply sounding the alarm is not sufficient to motivate people to take action. And my sense is, the longer you do this work, the bigger your container becomes, like your emotional container, and potentially your capacity for holding difficult emotions and contradictory feelings. Because in my personal experience, the longer I do this work, the more clear I am on how I can make a meaningful difference, like where I can show up to create change. And the challenge is that I think for a lot of people, when they first learn about climate, it's so big and it's so intersectional, right? It's not just the food you eat, it's the clothes you wear, it's how you get around the places you live. It's learning about capitalism, it's learning about the fossil fuel industry, it's learning about deeply entrenched inequality. That, you learn all of that and you're like, oh my God, like I have nowhere to really place these feelings. I don't necessarily have anything to channel them into. And all of the actions that have kind of been promoted to me, that I've been educated on, turning off my lights when I leave a room, like buying a reusable coffee cup, like none of these actions we implicitly know are proportionate to the scale of the problems. So I agree completely with your insinuation that like we need to open our eyes to what's happening. And I think we need to be self-aware as to what input, like what we consume, and how that is going to affect our ability to take action. And this is something I've really learned and practiced through Buddhism in my practice at Plum Village. There is one of the mindfulness trainings, which is about consumption, right? And it's not just the food you put into your body, but it is what you consume by way of the conversations you have, what you consume by way of media and social media. And I think for me as an activist, like I had my catalytic moment when I was very young. I had this moment, and I have a responsibility to ensure that I am educated, but I can also draw kind of boundaries around that. Like, particularly as a climate activist, I, in many ways, am like the confessional among my friends, among my family. Everyone sends me the climate articles they come across. I compliment a friend on an outfit and, she turns bright red and confesses that it's from Primark. And, so much of your identity becomes about climate. But I've made a very conscious decision to, not watch every documentary that comes across my desk, like not, read every article. When each IPCC report comes out, I read the headlines so that I have enough data points to be able to incorporate that into my speaking and my communication. But I don't go in depth because I know that I know the parameters of my emotional container at that time. And I know that if I take on anything else, it is likely to overflow and render me incapable of doing, much else. So I say all of that in terms of like a very pragmatic response to, what personally helps me be able to keep doing this work. The flip side to that is that there is a very natural grieving process that needs to happen, right? And a grief toward what's happening in the world, a grief at all of the future outcomes that may no longer be possible, a grief, simply in response to what we've already lost. And I think that's why the kind of narrative of, 3 years left to save the planet, 5 years left to save the planet is it's insufficient to capture the kind of complexity and nuance of this moment, because a lot of people, like the victims of the flooding in Pakistan, like the victims of, Hurricane Helene, now Milton, like for a lot of people, it is already too late. And that is a really difficult truth to hold, right? For the species that have gone extinct, it is already too late. But I think that is why the spiritual practice, in response to your first question, is so incredibly important, because we need to learn how to tend to that suffering as an experience of what it means to be human today. We need to be able to tend to that suffering and also see the beauty in that suffering. And that's why I don't see emotions as like binaries, right? Like I never just feel hopeful or I never just feel grief, because my grief is an expression of the deep love that I have for the earth and the deep love that I have for my community and for people around the world. That is a wonderful thing, right? Like that grief in many ways should be celebrated in our society. And many cultures, particularly indigenous communities, around the world, they have faced genocide. They have faced the extinction of many of their, cultures and peoples and practices. And there is so much wisdom to be learned from those remaining communities of how they have evolved and transformed throughout the decades and learnt to tend to that grief, not as something to kind of run away from, but as a necessary part of this like journey of walking this path and choosing to then do something with those, feelings, right? So the spiritual practice is incredibly important. And, before I started practicing Buddhism, I think I was a very spiritual person, although that wasn't necessarily like under any particular label. And even now, like I wouldn't necessarily self-identify as a Buddhist. I practice Buddhism, but, I think it is inherently spiritual, because to be an activist is to be deeply connected to the hurt and suffering, and to really choose to be part of something that is kind of bigger than yourself, right? Like bigger than your ego, in service to something that is more meaningful. And a lot of people ask, like, because part of my job today is going and speaking on these stages, in places like COP, addressing world leaders, going into rooms with thousands of people. And a lot of people go, oh my God, like, how do you do that? Like, how do you not get nervous? How do you not feel fear, whatever? First thing I'll say, I get all of those feelings. Like I feel all of the anxiety and fear and stress. But the truth is, the first time I ever gave a speech, I genuinely thought I was going to like vomit all over the audience, because I was so petrified. And I have a very wise mother. And I spoke to my mom and I was like, oh, I'm just terrified. What if I stuff up? Like, what if I forget my lines? What if I embarrass myself? And she kind of put her hands on my shoulders and she said, Clove, you're allowing your ego to get in the way. And you're really worried about what other people think, but this is not about you. Like right now, you are the conduit for a message that is much bigger than you and your worries and your anxieties. And so you just need to stay connected to that source, that message, and you'll be fine. And I've really lived by that principle in everything that I do. It's what gives me the moral courage to call out companies to their faces. Like last week, I was invited to speak at a Chamber of Commerce event, and it was sponsored by H&M. 5 minutes before I go on stage, I'm pulled aside by an organizer, and they told me, whatever you do, don't call out H&M. We don't want you calling out H&M. And interrogating me and pushing me. right? And I feel this emotion kind of like bubbling up within me. I'm like, how dare you try and, censor me? But I stayed connected to that source. And I genuinely visualized like the ancestors who I'm related to and those who I'm not, who have come before me, right? This incredible lineage of people that I'm part of and that I will be part of the continuation of for the generations that come after me. And I visualize myself as part of this kind of tapestry of life. And I got up on stage and I not only called out H&M, but I called out the event organizers. And I told the audience, I was like, moments before I came up here, the organizers of this event tried to stop me from calling out this company. And that for me is indicative of the deep discomfort there is to calling out business as usual and being challenging. But this moment demands tremendous courage from each and every one of us to lean into that discomfort, to be willing to challenge things, to be willing to be those disruptors. It's not fun. It's like, I think some people think I'm a naturally like conflicty person, or, I'm argumentative. I'm truly not. Like, I don't get a kick out of calling out companies and being challenging, but I know it's what this moment demands of me. So all to say, I think having a spiritual practice is so important because it helps alleviate the fear of what if I'm judged, or what if I can't get a job, or, what if I'm criticized, or all of these voices that can kind of come up of doubt and uncertainty. And it grounds us in the fact that it's not only necessary to show up in this way, but, it's a beautiful thing as well. And we get to be part of a movement that leaves our fingerprints on history and that helps plant the seeds so that the next generation of people who take up these movements, take up these causes, are in that much better of a position to create a world by their own design. So that is the belief and practice that I try to stay grounded in.
I feel like I'm listening to some 80-year-old wise woman talking, because you already have tons of experiences. And I also believe your practice, your maybe your personality, and most of all, how much you care. So brought you here. I really have more questions to ask, but I think I should be more selfless and ask our audience if anybody wants to. You can just go ahead, start asking questions, or otherwise you can use, there's a hand sign. You can use that sign to raise your hand. In the meantime, during registration, we already asked people to put down their questions. So there were young people asking how to really start a movement and how to organize, because I also really want to know, when you, at the very, very beginning of Force of Nature, how did it happen? Because the young audience wrote down that 3 years ago in Taiwan, there was a referendum on whether or not to damage some local biodiversity in order to build a new LNG terminal. And that referendum, we lost. I mean, the environmentalists lost. The young person, I guess, he or she was very involved in that movement. At that time, there were a lot of young people getting together, and they worked really, really hard for the signatures. They really mobilized. But according to him or her, after that, it just kind of dissolved. It disappeared. So there's nothing to hold them together. So he or her, she or he wants to know how to organize something, how to mobilize, how to do even fundraising, how to bring people together and to stick together over time.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And first off, I just want to commend that young person and all of the people who participated in that movement. I'm reading a really beautiful book at the moment called Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit. And it feels very timely and relevant. It was first written at the beginning of the Iraq War, and Rebecca was a peace activist. And she really, in this book, I think, kind of interrogates what it means to succeed, like what a successful movement looks like versus one that fails. And I think, we can look at these moments like the Iraq War, for example, and say, oh, well, that movement failed, right? Because it didn't prevent, America from like dropping those bombs. It didn't, stop the bloodshed. But I don't think we ever can fully comprehend the ripples of our actions. And we don't know how that organizing, right, of these activists in Taiwan, how that might have planted seeds for something else to emerge. And that's not to dismiss how painful it is when things don't go to plan, right? And when we don't, gain those wins, and we need to take time to kind of, I've had that experience, like go into hibernation and sit with the grief of that. But all to say, there's every chance that something else will be born again. And we can't yet anticipate what that might look like. But for me, it's a very kind of humbling thought. And I have this experience all the time, as an activist where, I was at an event a few weeks ago and someone came up to me and she was like, oh, you won't remember me, but we met 4 years ago. You came and ran like an hour-long workshop at Nestle, right? I talked to a bunch of young professionals within Nestle, and I was very challenging, and I implored them to be disruptive and agitators. Anyway, I barely remembered it, but she said, after that particular session, I quit my job. I was really passionate about farming. I've since gone on to create a regenerative farm. We're working with, thousands of people in my community to take back, land sovereignty. And it was just this incredible story of kind of the ripple effect. And I don't fully attribute that to myself, of course, but you never know the influence that you're having in the lives of the people around you. So that's just the first thing I want to say. If that young person is on this call, I just want to say thank you for the work that you're doing, and trust that the impact of your actions far exceeds what you may even be able to see right in front of you. In terms of the pragmatic question of like, how do we sustain movements? I think in some instances, they're not necessarily meant to be sustained. And what I mean by that is that they're meant to evolve. I think when we don't win, it's important to come back together and understand, what potentially would we have to do differently, right? What other tactics might we need to employ the next time around? And also see that change isn't a static thing. Like in the UK, we had, Rosebank approved the largest untapped drilling field in the North Sea. And that was after years of campaigning. And it was heartbreaking when that approval was granted. And yet young people kept organizing, kept mobilizing. And as a result, with the largest youth voter turnout in the UK's history, the Labour Party got into power. They're not perfect, but they contested that Rosebank license, which means that young people can take these companies, Equinor, who are responsible for this field, to court, which wasn't possible before. So, cracks of opportunity and hope are kind of opening up again. And so I think, questioning how do we need to reorganize in a different way, it's really important that we have this people-powered grassroots movement. And from my own experience, it's important that you have allies within the system as well, right? Whether that is an agitator or someone who can feed you information. Like I've personally worked with whistleblowers within companies before, people on the inside who can feed you information, understanding, okay, what if we take a step back, what piece of legislation might need to pass in order to prevent this from happening, which is a much longer term effort, but how do we realign on a kind of objective? And which leads me to my next point, which I think is that, for any movement, it's really important to have the focus of a goal and to not only be able to articulate the problem, right? Which it sounds like this movement has done very effectively. Why, getting this approved is an issue. But also be able to say, like, here is very clearly our set of demands. Like Extinction Rebellion did that really effectively in the UK in 2019. Their first headline demand was the UK government needs to declare a climate emergency. And as a result of the 2019 mobilizing, the UK government was the first in the world to do exactly that, which created a precedent then for people to be able to sue the government if they were working not in alignment with that recognition. And so having very clear kind of demands, and I think also ensuring that we're appealing to the varied things that people care about. I think often in campaigning, it's really alluring and tempting to say, like, what's the one narrative, right, that's going to appeal to everyone? And the reality is, like, in a very diverse and unfortunately increasingly fractured world, people care about different things for different reasons, right? The reason I care about an environmental piece of legislation is going to be very different to the reason why someone else might care. And so making sure we're appealing to those different value sets, whether it's like the co-benefit of, like, if we do this, it will have these unintended consequences on people's health. It will cost people more money. It'll be bad for nature, yes, but it will also be bad for business in these ways. You're essentially creating a web which people from varied lived experience and backgrounds can kind of tap into. So I think when thinking about our messaging, that is really, really important. And then finally, sorry, this is a lot, but I think in terms of what I've observed with like movements like Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil, it is really important that you kind of model the types of organizing structures that you want to see in the world. And that doesn't mean like complete chaos, but it does mean having like a cooperative type model where people are bought in, where a varied group of people are able to participate in decision making. There is democratic voting. So it's amazing if you can use a piece of campaigning or messaging to get 1,000 people to show up for a protest. But then what is the structure that is going to encourage people to sustain their action? And how do you organize people around something that is bigger than one particular policy, ask one particular piece of legislation? Because win or fail, you want to be able to sustain that movement ongoing. So having a long-term vision that people can galvanize around, I think, is just as important.
Thank you. Anyone in the audience want to ask questions, or you can just jump in or raise your hand using that hand sign. Anyone? Okay, go ahead.
So, thank you, Clover. I'm very excited to be in this chat and meet you. I'm a high school student in Taiwan, and very interested in also climate activism. I have 3 questions, kind of complicated, but so the first one is that there has always been a negative connotation underlying towards climate activists in my environment, that maybe people, even myself, over a year ago, like, we loathe when we see these intensive and sometimes violent protests that look like nonsense coming from these like climate protesters, and we link climate activism to these scenes that we see that we don't like, and thus a lot of people around me actually don't want the opposite of it, and don't want climate activism to be held maybe in our school or even in our community. What's your how do you respond to that, and how can we revise our narrative to persuade also these people? And do I finish all my 3 questions, or do I
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So the second one is that on my observation on high school students in Taiwan, or a broader scope on students in Taiwan, that we are deeply rooted with this sense of diplomas, and degrees and academics that's important. And like I think our first questions or two were also based on this, that people don't feel like they have this opportunity, or they have this this time to do all these activism. And not only that, maybe my fellow students in Taiwan, my fellow classmates in Taiwan, we also don't really feel the urgency that we see all these things on news that, okay, there's like heat waves and all these natural disasters, but it seems like it's not really happening to us that intensively, and we can go to somewhere else if we don't like it. So I think that's also why a lot of people are disassociated with climate change, or I think it's not really my problem. And my question here is that how, in this case, how do we get these like disinterested students also have a mindset of climate change happening to everyone, and especially having a personal connection with them. And then the third question is upon spirituality, that I was just reading like an article of yours, like from your website, about how you left the Christian community from a college perspective, and then you were more engaged with critical being critical to this religion, and then you moved into Buddhism, as you described right now. But so will you encourage these young people to also move into a specific religion, or as you said, a religion to admit that you're not the biggest or you're not the center of this whole problem, and that there is a greater either deity or ancestry that is passing on to you? Will you encourage this mindset? And yes, thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for those beautiful questions. Each one is so rich, and thank you for doing some research as well. I'm happy to circle back to the question around religion, because I think it's a really interesting one. I think, okay, starting with your first question and what I synthesized from that, kind of like a bit of pushback in terms of like certain activist tactics and more radical forms of activism. We've definitely seen that same rhetoric in the public in the UK in response to, Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. And I think only recently has that started to shift back in the other direction because of the recent prison sentences, which I can speak to. But I think so I actually just recorded a new TEDx talk on this subject, which is about the way the media portrays activism. And again, I think it's really important to identify the influence that media has on public perception. I'm not sure about Taiwan specifically, but I know in the UK, you read the headlines about activists and it's, they're fanatics, they're extremists, they're part of a climate cult. It's very antagonistic and inflammatory language. And that's no coincidence, right? If you look at the media outlets in the UK, The Sun, the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, they're owned by Rupert Murdoch, Jonathan Harmsworth, the Barclay family, all billionaires, all with a vested interest in protecting their wealth, protecting their profit, and squashing anyone who really refutes that. And the most common kind of criticism specific to climate activists is one of hypocrisy, right? And there's an interview that went really viral a couple years ago on Good Morning Britain between Miranda Wellahan, a 20-year-old activist from Just Stop Oil, and Richard Madley, a 65-year-old host of the show. And, you know, she's there relaying the science, she's relaying, you know, the facts, and he keeps saying, oh, but, you know, what about the clothes you're wearing? They're just as much made from oil. You know, who are you to point fingers? And she's kind of tearing her hair out because she's like, what? We're talking about crop failure by 2030. We're talking about, you know, the government granting all these oil and gas licenses, and you're talking about the clothes that I'm wearing? Like, this is insane. And, you know, this is the kind of rhetoric that activists are up against every day. So I think, for one, it's really important to recognize the impact that the media has, and how the result of that is not just a divided public, but a really weakened democracy. So I spoke to these prison sentences just a couple of months ago. 5 protesters, peaceful protesters, nonviolent protesters, were imprisoned with 4- and 5-year sentences, which are the harshest sentences in UK history for peaceful protest. And they were arrested not even for protesting, but for their role in planning 2-stage protests, which I'm not sure if you've read 1984, but is really, really terrifying, because it means that anyone who merely plans to organize is potentially at risk of being imprisoned. What was really interesting, though, is that those decisions were not, in fact, reflective of public opinion. When they polled people afterwards, the vast majority of Brits said this is completely like draconian. And I think people are starting to join the dots of, yeah, it's a bit annoying, but why is a peaceful protester going to jail for 5 years when we're not sentencing the fossil fuel executives who are making billions while people can't afford their energy bills? So I think it's important, you know, when we're having these conversations with friends and family, to ground this in, as, you know, don't invalidate people's feelings. Like, yes, protest can be a little frustrating, right? It can stop you from getting to work on time. It can be annoying, but the disruption that these activists are creating is nowhere near proportionate to the disruption that is anticipated by climate change. We're seeing that with, you know, the hurricanes in America right now displacing millions of people. We saw that the fires that killed 2 billion, 3 billion animals in Australia in 2019. You know, in Taiwan, you have your own specific set of kind of natural disasters and, you know, disruptions that are caused by climate change. And so I think grounding the conversation in the fact that this is not a crazy response, but a proportionate one. And the purpose of these demonstrations is not to get people offside or frustrate them. It is to alert the government, who are elected there to represent our interests, to the fact that people care about these issues, and they're not going to go off, you know, into the horizon quietly. Like, they're going to go kicking and screaming. So I think, for one, it's really important to interrogate, like, where do our ideas and beliefs come from around activists? And Rebecca Solnit actually has a great quote in her book where she says that, you know, the mainstream media, you know, likes to depict, you know, public resistance as ridiculous or criminal unless it was far away, was long ago, or ideally both, right? And that's true of the suffragettes, right? Like, we look back now at the suffragettes and go, oh my God, how incredible. Like, you won't hear someone in the UK in 2024, you know, disrespecting the suffragettes, because they're the reason we as women have the ability to participate in democracy. But they were far more radical than the climate activists of today in the UK. Like, they were not just, you know, throwing soup on paintings, which don't inherently damage them. They were destroying original artworks. They were planting bombs. Like, whether you agree or disagree with those tactics, you can't refute the fact that they were instrumental in leading to the Equal Franchise Act, leading to that outcome. And while they received tremendous pushback at the time, now with the benefit of history, we can say direct action is so important in changing policy and changing the government stance on things. So that is the first thing I would say. I'll try to keep my responses a little shorter to your other questions. I think the first one around connecting to young people, I think a lot of people feel very overwhelmed by climate change because it is a symptom of so many broken systems, right? But I think the flip side of that is that you can find entry points for people to care about no matter what they're passionate about, no matter what they're interested in, right? Because when you talk about climate change, yes, it's carbon in the atmosphere, yes, it's emissions, but it's also like how we get around the places we live. It's the clothes we wear. It's the food we eat. It's how we communicate with one another. It's our policy processes. And I can guarantee that within that picture, you can find something for someone to connect with. And again, grounded in the values they care about. What I've observed working with business leaders is that oftentimes their wake-up call doesn't come from the IPCC report, doesn't come from attending COP, but comes from their kids coming home to them at the end of the day and asking, Mom, Dad, what are you doing about climate change? Because that appeals to something very human and very fundamental, which is the job of a parent to protect their children. And many people in business justify, being part of this like corporate hamster wheel because they're trying to provide for their families, right? They're like, I will get this salary and this job position, this title, so that my kids have a secure future. But by every measure of climate science, the world is on fire and it's heading in a really scary direction. And so more and more leaders are starting to question, what is my legacy going to be, right? Like, I've worked so hard to, provide for my family. What is the world that I'm handing over to them? And so again, that might be it for a business leader, but for your peers and friends, like, what is the thing that appeals to them? Maybe it's like social clout. Maybe it's community, like realizing there's this amazing international community of activists, realizing that like a university degree is not necessarily the be all end all. I didn't go to university. I don't have a degree. For me, it was more important that I get out into the world and get hands-on experience. And I think the conventional 9 to 5 is not as attractive to young people anymore. Like, there is this rise of conscious quitting around the world because young people don't want to work for organizations that misalign with their values, right? They don't necessarily want to do this corporate slog. They want to do something and do work that has purpose and has meaning. So I think with your peers at high school, it's like figuring out specific to them, what are those things that appeal to them? Like, what is cool? What is aspirational? And speaking to that. Finally, on religion, sorry, you asked such great questions. They all necessitate long responses. So I had a very singular experience of like Catholicism growing up. So I was growing up in a small town in Australia, 6,000 people. And from a really early age, I was very passionate about earth sciences. And my particular school growing up taught creationism. And those two things are very at odds with one another. If you're passionate about evolution, it doesn't necessarily align with what, some people's interpretation of the Bible. So I remember this very like one fateful day of show and tell when I, would have been like 8 or 9. And I remember taking in one of these fossils from my dad's collection and saying to my teacher and to my like peers, like, oh my God, this is incredible. This thing is like millions of years old. Like, I can't even wrap my head around that number. And my teacher very quickly shut me down and said, the earth is 7,000 years old and the devil planted those rocks to lead you astray from God. So a very extreme end. I don't think most Christians or Catholics hold that particular belief, but in my personal inference, that was my experience. And from that point on, I think I really started to distrust the kind of religious figures in my life. And I think that made me quite apprehensive toward dogma and fearful of kind of faith in general. And it wasn't until I really went to Plum Village, this Buddhist monastery, for the first time that I rekindled that within myself without the kind of cynicism and through the lens of a spiritual practice, because Buddhism in that discipline is not really a religion, to just use this as kind of like a moral framework. But, so many of my friends have faith, like my best friends in the world are Muslim, and I find their faith and practice deeply inspiring because also a big part of their religion is service and giving back, and seeing how that positively influenced them in the world was really a big motivation as well for me exploring that, what faith, meant to me, which is a very like personal thing. And it's true of my like Catholic and Christian friends. I think oftentimes like having that faith is what allows you to show up in the world, right? And to question, what does it mean to kind of be in service? And unfortunately, I think, any religion, any spiritual doctrine can be kind of taken advantage of or, used for, an ulterior motive. But I don't have a strong opinion on whether it's good or bad. I think people just need to kind of look into themselves and understand, like, what is the spiritual framework or practice that helps me show up in the world. And that can be religion, it can be spiritualism, or it can be something that you don't even have to put a name or a label on. Thank you
so
for the
much.
question. Thank you.
Thank you, Selena, for your questions. We have 3 or 4 minutes left. Anyone in the audience, I suggest that you really take this opportunity to either just jump in or raise your hand. Otherwise, in the registration form, some other, I suppose, young people also asked the question about political atmosphere right now, especially in Europe. He or she asked that, said that the Green parties seem to be losing support. And also, this part is mine. I also, you mentioned Just Stop Oil and the general atmosphere of censorship. You mentioned 1984. All these political atmosphere combined, does that make you less hopeful, or I also want to ask if you are afraid. Are there times that you're fearful how far I can go, how much I can challenge the system? And are you always just daring and courageous, and are there limits? So that's the question.
Yeah, it's a great one. I think on a personal level, I think I often feel fearful, but I think I'm still, in a relative privilege bubble, and I'm very humbled by my friends who are environmental activists in countries where, they have no right to protest, and who choose anyway to kind of flout those laws and go up against their governments and have oftentimes paid the price. I have a friend in India, for example, who is essentially under house arrest for her involvement in, Fridays for the Future, and, is going to court essentially, and, has to, is monitored wherever she goes. All of her text exchanges have to be cryptic because, of her government. And so I'm very aware of like the privileges that I have. And I think if anything, that kind of galvanizes me more, because I'm like, well, so long as I still have, the right to speak out and to be challenging, I'm going to exercise that to the fullest extent. In terms of the rise of, fascism in Europe, it is really scary. I think, it's obviously different country by country, but we're seeing a big kind of generational divides. We saw that in Italy. Italy actually had some of the highest support of the Green Party ever within the youth population. But then more and more of the older generations are kind of falling toward this like alt-right. I think also like with the Green New Deal in Europe, it received a lot of momentum, and then there was a lot of pushback because it was seen as too controlling, or, cracking down on farmers, cracking down on working class people. There is a lot of kind of misinformation. So, I think I believe in the fundamental good of people. I think ultimately, in my experience, if you sit down across from someone as opposed to exchanging tweets on the internet, I think you can find common ground with pretty much anyone on earth. And I think that's a beautiful thing. Like, I think people are inherently social, collaborative creatures, but there are some very nefarious forces at play that are trying to polarize us. And we've seen that with social media and the rise of misinformation. Elon Musk basically taking a platform hostage and turning it into a playground of conspiracy theories and hate speech. And I think the only way to really combat that is to pass legislation, uphold regulation that are going to stop those powerful players. I think Brazil, very inspiring for its leadership in cracking down on Twitter, on banning it as a platform. I'd like to see, more countries kind of follow suit and really like nipping it in the bud before it is allowed to, corrode our politics and the public beyond the point of no return. But again, I think a lot of language around climate has become highly politicized and polarized. And that's why in my communication, again, I try to tailor it to who I'm speaking to and really understand the values, needs, fears, anxieties of people. Because actually, a lot of the research shows that when you say climate, it's become a very bipartisan kind of issue. It polarizes people along the political spectrum in the US. But if you talk about the solutions that underpin climate action, whether it is better education or more resilient food systems, not subsidizing oil and gas, but subsidizing clean energy, which generates jobs, the vast majority of people are in support of that. There's research from the UNDP which found that 80% of people globally, 4 out of 5 people globally, want to see greater action from their governments on climate. So we do actually have public opinion on our side, but we kind of have to walk this tightrope now of not falling into language that has been kind of abused, that has been corrupted, and just really ground it in what are people's everyday experiences and how do we appeal to what people care about.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to let you know that I think you have already made some great impact here in Taiwan, I think so far. And I'm going to put up Chinese subtitles. It's going to reach more people. And I really appreciate what you do at this young age. You have already done so much, and with such, I'm not kidding, I mean wisdom, because how you talk about dealing with these emotions and setbacks and all these stuff. I think it's really it can only be there with your experience, and so I really appreciate that. And I wish you the best of luck on the work that you are going to continue to do. I don't know if you dislike people telling you that we are so thankful that we have climate youth, but it sounds like we're dumping our responsibilities on you. But truthfully, I do feel that way. I really feel that it's where hope is. I hope you understand what I mean. So best of luck, and I appreciate your wisdom and your time. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Taiwan is one of my favorite countries. I used to go quite a lot for Model United Nations, and I met some beautiful, beautiful people in Taiwan, in Taipei and Taichung, and I hope I get to go back in person someday soon because it's a wonderful country. And nice to be able
you must. And I think I'll try to figure out a way, maybe starting Climate Cafe here. I'm not sure if there's already people doing that, but I think it's a great idea, sharing our grief and as channeling our anxiety into agency.
Absolutely.
So,
well, thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure and privilege.
thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Good luck. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Selena. Bye.